That continues. So we're in Job 29. And does anybody remember the content of Job 28? You're welcome to look and see. Anything jump out from that study?
We talked about mind, that there is no wisdom down there, but wisdom is only in God.
Yeah. Yep. And I love that parallel that he talks about how we're just going to mine the earth and take great risk for gold, but where do we mine to find wisdom? Where do we dig down? And that wisdom that expressly he was looking for here is trying to understand what's going on in his situation, but it's really a statement of ultimate truth, is that his friends were kind of coming with all this shallow wisdom, all of these theories that didn't really account for all of the facts, right? So that's why they kept just defaulting to that horrifying, like, oh, you're guilty. You did something. Come on, confess. What did you do? And that wrong attitude. So when we look into chapter 29, we're going to see, and with any luck at all, we'll get through 29, 30, and 31 tonight. But 29, by and large, is Job pining for what we might say are the good old days, remembering what he lost. And we want to remind us again, this is maybe months in the past. Like, we've spent several months studying this, so that could make Job's trial sound longer. But this was, I mean, in terms of what we think about in like PTSD and the amount of like torture or torment that a person can experience from any traumatic affair or traumatic situation, he'd be only at the beginning phases of that level of grief kind of at this point. So it's kind of interesting. 29 is looking back to the days before. 30 is lamenting what had been taken from him, as well as beginning his statement of innocence. And then finally 31, he goes through listing off the sins that he hadn't done and what he believed true righteousness to be. And again, we need to remember, this book already has defended Job's righteousness, right? So it's kind of a cool set of chapters, because now Job is actually going to go through all the lines with his accusers at hand, and it's why once Job's done talking, they're all just going to shut up. They're done, because he's going to go through and say, these are these sins that I didn't do, and these are so on and so forth. So with that, let's pick up with 29. If someone wants to read 1 through 6.
Job further continued his discourse and said, "Oh, that I were as in months past, as in the days when God watched over me, when his lamp shone upon my head, and when by his light I walked through darkness. Just as I was in the days of my time, when the friendly counsel of God was over my tent, when the Almighty was yet with me, when my children were around me, when my steps were bathed with cream, and the rock poured out rivers of oil for me."
Awesome. So Job is here kind of taking stock of like, oh, that it was in the past. But I think it's a pretty common thing when something goes wrong, right? And when something fundamentally changes, to look back on, oh, what was it like before this sickness hit? What was it like before this situation changed? What was it like before? And I think there's a healthy way and an unhealthy way that we can attach to that. What would be the healthy way to attach to the time before? Can you think of anything? Any healthy way?
Looking back in appreciation or thankfulness for the time that you had.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we forget, right, that every moment that we have is especially a moment of blessing, and the peace that's around us. And it's easy to get caught up in whatever's difficult at the time, but forget to take great joy in that there are going to be more difficult times ahead. And we'll be pining for what we ought to appreciate. And so there's that joyous and blessed, like, Lord, thank you for that incredibly time of blessing before, right? And I think that's a valuable thing to do, if we can look back and recognize that, God has been good to us, and that we weren't even worthy of that blessing. But then on the negative side, right, we can also get in that desire like, oh, almost jealous of that time, or thinking that we were entitled to that. And really, that's what we want to point out. It's fascinating how many people will say they disbelieve, or they choose, or they lose faith in God because of a difficult time. And you're going, well, then do you gain belief in God during a good time? Like it's absurd to think, right, that our faith in God is so deeply attached to how we perceive things are going at any given moment, when we recognize that we're not owed a single moment of peace or prosperity on this planet. It's all a function of God's amazing grace. Is worth noting. I do love that picture, though, is that when the Almighty was yet with me. That's the interesting theological problem of what Job is saying, at least as I see it. He's assuming now that because things have gone bad, that the Almighty is against him. He said that a couple times, right? And has God ever been against him in this? Never once, right? In fact, if you were going to characterize God's attitude towards Job, what would you say? Yeah, Job's his star player. The Almighty, or God, has never been separate from him. He's never had his eyes off him for a single moment. And in fact, right, the incredible depths to which he's allowed Job to sink in this circumstance is actually a sign of the incredible confidence which God seemed to have in Job. And I think that's valuable for us to recognize. When things go awry for us, it's very easy for us to, fall into that, oh, God's against me. But really, in this case, and I think we can say, if you're a believer with a clear conscience, I'm not saying you've done everything perfect, but you've confessed your sin, you're walking right with the Lord, and you're still suffering, then you can be very confident in recognizing that God is using that trial for his glory in your life, and God's not against you, and he's certainly not absent from you. He's cheering for you and making you a trophy of his amazing grace and glory. I love this picture of my steps were bathed with cream, and the rock poured out rivers of oil for me. So cream, and obviously being the fatty, most valuable part of the milk, and this idea of oil coming forth from a rock and rivers. It's just this idea of opulent luxury. And I would point out that while Job certainly did have a pretty good situation, certainly before, we would also note that it's easy to kind of gussy things up when you look back on them, right? Mm-hmm. You're going through a time, and it was just 12th grade. It was just 11th grade. But then you get a couple years past it, and then, oh man, it was so wonderful, or however you look back on your 11th grade year. So we can tend to forget what the real experience was like, and that can choose to kind of make our current experience more painful. So, would someone want to read 7 through 17?
When I went out to the gate of the city, when I took my seat in the public square, the young men saw me and hid themselves, and the old men arose and stood. The leaders stopped talking and put their hands on their mouths. The voices of the prominent people were hushed, and their tongues stuck to their palates. For when an ear heard, it called me blessed, and when an eye saw, it testified in support of me, because I saved the poor who cried for help, and the orphan who had no helper. The blessing of the one who was about to perish came upon me, and I made the widow's heart sing for joy. I put on righteousness, and it clothed me. My justice was like a robe and a headband. I was eyes to those who were blind, and feet to those who could not walk. I was a father to the poor, and I investigated the case which I did not know. I broke the jaws of the wicked and rescued the prey from his teeth.
Yep, that's a great place to stop. Okay, so obviously he's looking back on this time before when he was respected and valued and admired in the city, and this kind of reminds me of, did everybody see Fiddler on the Roof? You never saw it?
When I was young.
Okay. So Tevye is the main character, and he's talking to God and asking, "Why didn't you make me rich?" And he points out at one point that if you're rich, then everybody asks you for advice, very respectfully. And he says it doesn't matter one bit if you answer right or wrong. When you're rich, they think you really know. And it's kind of funny because you would think, right, that this situation would cause Job to realize how worthless men's respect is, right? Nothing changed except for the external circumstances of his life. And yet before, men would, cover their mouths, and men would silence themselves before him, and no one would dare speak against him. And, oh, that I could have that time back. But really, what do we see? What is the respect of other people truly worth?
Not much. It seems to me like he's forgotten the burden of having that kind of respect and that kind of people. Because, I mean, really, honestly, like, when you're in that kind of a position, it can be really burdensome.
Mm-hmm.
Because everyone's eyes on you and everyone wants something from you. And
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Yeah,
It's not
no,
really
very much
answering
so.
your question, but
No, it is. I mean, it's getting to the point that we can oftentimes come to value things incorrectly. It's really fascinating to me as people age, especially. I think it's hard, and I notice this particularly with men, but I'm sure it's everyone. But men have this tendency of like remembering the time when they were in their maybe late 30s, 40s, 50s, because boy, they were at the top of their game and everyone listened to them. And then you get older into your 60s and 70s and 80s, and nobody cares what you have to say. You're out of touch. You're old. You're so on and so forth. And they think back on the time when they were respected and useful and important, and the realization that they're not less worthy of respect. They're not, hopefully, less full of wisdom than they were. In fact, hopefully they're more full of wisdom. And yet the world only truly respects what it can, like you said, Brian, what it can get out of you. So the people didn't actually respect him. They respected the fact that he had tons of money, that he had power, that he had authority, right? And so it's fascinating that he looks back on that time as being, all this terribly blessed. But what you find out is if something like that goes away just because your financial circumstance goes away, then there was never really any respect there except for respect for money. It's kind of fascinating. But then he goes on, and I think he turns it to the right, or turns it to a better way of thinking, because he's pointing out that he wishes that he could be rich again because, or back in that position of health and wealth and prosperity, because he was eyes to the blind, feet to the lame, a father to the poor. He searched out the case that he did not know. So in other words, when he found out that something was going on or going wrong in his world, he would go, because he was the one who had the luxury and the liberty to take the time, he would take the time to figure out what was going on, right? You think about, now we've got courts in place and law systems and police officers, but in the ancient world, that was just ultimately, if you could get someone who is wealthy enough to take up your cause, you might be able to see justice taking place. So and he talks about breaking the fangs of the wicked and plucking the victim from his teeth. So he's saying that he used, or he believed, and he certainly did, based on what Job chapter 1 and 2 says about him, but he was using his wealth for the care of others, right? And that's going to be a continual theme, is that he'd like to get, it's interesting that the motivation, obviously there's some motivation in just wanting to be well respected, but also pointing out that now he's lost his ability to serve others in the way that he had before. And that's something that he misses. Someone want to read 18 through the end of the chapter? 18 through 25?
I thought, I will die in my own house, my days as numerous as the grains of sand. My roots will reach to the water, and the dew will lie all night on my branches. My glory will not fade, the bow will be ever new in my hand. People listened to me expectantly, waiting in silence for my counsel. After I had spoken, they spoke no more. My words fell gently on their ears. They waited for me as for showers, and drank in my words as the spring rain. When I smiled at them, they scarcely believed it. The light of my face was precious to them. I chose the way for them and sat as their chief. I dwelt as a king among his troops. I was like one who comforts mourners.
Good. So it's interesting here, because this makes me think of, again, many of us here will remember Herb Norton, and I'll just never forget when the day that he lost his wife. He didn't expect, she was so much younger, he didn't expect that she would go first. She went breast cancer, I think, after it was her third relapse. And I just remember him just weeping, and what came through so profoundly is that he had convinced himself that This wasn't supposed to happen to him, right? I mean, goodness gracious, he married this gal who was 30 years his junior. That you were supposed to be like in the clear. He was supposed to die first. That's the way it was supposed to go. He was supposed to die first and then leave, a decent life for her so she could live out her days. And that was how it was supposed to go. He's entitled to that, right? And I just really appreciate what Job says in verse 18. He says, I just thought I'd die in my nest. I'd die in my house and that multiply my days. I was owed that, those latter years of rich, fruitful retirement. But what are we owed those times? What is it? What's something that you have in your plan for yourself that it might be a risk that you'd feel entitled to?
My Social Security.
My Social Security? Yep, you're definitely not getting that. Just kidding.
No, I mean, honestly though, retirement that you've saved for years and years for, that until recently I really thought, oh yeah, I gotta do this, and
Mm-hmm.
ultimately that could be gone in a blink of an eye,
Mm-hmm.
and it wouldn't be there, and we would only have the Lord to trust in at that point to take care of us.
Mm-hmm.
And it may mean working till you either die or cannot physically work at all anymore.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. Think of anything else that you feel, or that we could risk feeling entitled to?
When one person dies in your family, it's a lot. There is a lot to do for the family who are still alive, right? So like when Steve's dad died, he was busy. Luckily his dad had written down all the things that Steve has to do, and these are the phone numbers he should call. That was really nice, but still, that was a lot. So I wish I go first. I don't have to deal with that. But we'll see.
We don't get to choose, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Absolutely. I'm doing everything in my power to make sure I go first. And yet, really, if you watch me eat dinner most nights, you'd think that I was striving for it. But
I would also say you feel entitled to having good health and prosperity, and living out your days with your wife after the kids are out, and you feel entitled, sitting on a beach somewhere, going on vacations.
mm-hmm. Yeah, those expectations of health, absolutely. No, we're not entitled to tomorrow's health, much less, after you get super old. April, do you got any ideas?
Mine is similar, just to have your family and continue on with them being healthy and well.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Job had every reason to expect that that's exactly what was going to happen. He'd saved, he'd been responsible. We're going to see had a right relationship with God. Everything was going according to plan, and it totally made sense to him. In fact, he felt like God had stolen the future that he was owed or deserved. But it's the better part of wisdom to recognize that we're not owed, promised. We don't deserve that at all. So I think there's two major applications that we can make for that. One for this realization. One is for this moment, and one is for eternity. First, for this moment, I think we can apply the reality that know that this might be the best day of your life. This might be the moment you look back on for a sense of solace and comfort. Whether you feel like it or not, it just gives us all the encouragement that we need, hopefully, to appreciate and be so thankful to the Lord in whatever this moment is. Because we don't know what's ahead. We don't know what suffering might lie ahead for us. And at least we can look and freeze every precious moment that we get to be with our families, that we get to enjoy this level of health, and on and on. So I think there's a level of gratitude that this is all God's grace that needs to dominate the attitude that we have towards this moment, which will also help give us a better understanding and attitude during the suffering. The attitude or the application for eternity is, again, it is our the risk of our humanity and our functional atheism to try to put the heaven on earth goal somewhere past, just over the horizon. It's retirement. It's when we've got the beach house. It's when we've got the whatever it is, right? Or even just maybe we think we have very modest, desires. Like, I just want to retire and paint my pictures or whatever, thing is. It might be the most modest thought in the world, but we're not here to put heaven on earth. Our eternity with the Lord is our hope. And if we put it anywhere else, then we're bound to be disappointed, even if we get what we think we want. Ultimately, our unity or walk with the Lord is the most important thing while we're here. And our hope is not, for, again, our silver years or anything like that. Our hope is for the eternity with Christ. And that means that we might say we work all the way up to the bell. We might be blessed not to be able to retire, right? But we're still going to be serving the Lord all the way up to the bell. That's always our job. That is always what we're going to be doing. The rest, if we like, is after our physical life is over or after the Lord comes for us. Does that sound reasonable? Cool beans. And I love how he points out again that what he loved was being able to be a blessing to others. Now, this would be a cruel thing to say now, so his friends probably would say it, but the interesting thing is as he overcomes the shock, even if the Lord weren't to give him back everything, he could still be a blessing to others, right? And again, this is very close to his event of tragedy, and be tough to say, hey, buck up, you can still be nice to people now. But ultimately, right, just because he lost his wealth, his ability and his health, his ability to bless people on the level or scale that he was before, doesn't mean that he couldn't use the breath that he had to bless others. And we could argue that he does. I mean, he blesses all of us through this reaction. So it's kind of ironic that if Job had just lived a godly life, been wealthy, successful, and prosperous, and died as he expected to in his old age, we'd never have heard of him. He wouldn't be important. He wouldn't matter. But he matters desperately to all of us in times of suffering because he gives us such a perfect illustration of what it means to suffer. So now we get into the really sad stuff in 31 through 8. Would someone like to read chapter 30, verses 1 through 8?
Okay. But now they mock me, men younger than I, whose fathers I would have disdained to put with my sheepdogs. Of what use was the strength of their hands to me, since their vigor had gone from them, haggard from want and hunger. They roamed the parched land in desolate wastelands at night. In the brush they gathered salt herbs, and their food was the root of the broom tree. They were banished from their fellow men, shouting as if they were thieves. They were forced to live in the dry stream beds, among the rocks and in holes in the ground. They brayed among the bushes and huddled in the undergrowth. A base and nameless brood is B-R-O-O-D. Brood. They were driven out of the land.
Excellent. So this is setting up a biblical reality that our modern world's not super comfortable with. There are scumbags on earth. That's just the reality. There are absolutely scumbags. There are men and women who choose, rather than to honor God with their lives and to have lives filled with holiness and gratitude, feel free to kick him right out of the way.
Oh, my foot's cramping.
Oh, that's no fun. Oh, weird. Yeah, exactly. Just somebody usurping your ground there. Just give him a little shove, he'll move. Yep. Yeah. That's right. So anyway, there's scumbags on earth. That's just the reality, the biblical reality. In fact, I was just teaching through for the radio show in Proverbs chapter 6 when it talks about the worthless and vile man. And this is kind of an important distinction because, right, the biblical worldview is that we are all sinners and we are all fallen, and yet there are people who are especially in their rejection of God's character and goodness and righteousness become super scum, right? Super useless, super reprobate, whatever you want to call it. We're all equally as easy to save or difficult to save, depending on how you look at it. I guess we'd say difficult to save. And salvation is available to all through Christ. But there is an actual judgment of a value of a person based on their right relationship to God, and or their rejection of that and of his principles and character. And so here he's talking about all these scumbags who are just above animals in how they lived. They treated others. And verse 9 continues with that after pointing out that these people were just, these young pups who were, snot-nosed, ungodly scumbags. He says, and I am their taunting song. Yes, I am their byword. They abhor me. They keep far from me. They do not hesitate to spit in my face because he loosed my bowstring and afflicted me. They have cast off restraint before me, and on my right hand the rabble arises. They push away my feet, and they raise me against me their ways of destruction. They break up my path. They promote my calamity. They have no helper. They come as broad breakers. Among the ruinous storm they roll along. Terrors are turned upon me. They pursue my honor as the wind, and my prosperity has passed like a cloud. So, another painful thing about this, and we of course we're going to see this from Job's perspective, right? All these slime balls, all these scumbags, all these wicked people that when he was powerful, when he was wealthy, he pursued justice for their victims. He pursued, them being their evil ways being punished, right? He was a force for good, and now all of a sudden he falls to the bottom. How do you think they treat him?
They have no more need for him, so they treat him worse than they would now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. And they, it's very clear, right? You can imagine that these are these scummy, dishonest criminals, vagabonds. He's comparing them to animals in the previous section that Nobu read, right? And now all of a sudden, he who was on top, he who was actively involved in persecuting them for their wickedness and stopping their wickedness and so on. So he was willing to do all that. Is now on the bottom, and they can spit on him, and they can kick him, and they can mock him, right? It's the ultimate, it's the ultimate payback for the years which he used his wealth and power to bring forth justice and righteousness on the earth, and now all of a sudden they get their turn to just mock him and run him down and say, "Look, all your righteousness, it was all garbage." And so they get to publicly disrespect him.
It actually happened, or is he imagining in his mind that that's how, just because he feels so horrible, that's how people are viewing him? Or do you think he was actually enduring this kind of mockery from the scum of society?
It's a really good question, and I couldn't be dogmatic, but I would say that it's certainly possible that it absolutely happened. It's hard for us to really understand because, the Christian worldview has been so impactful and influential in our society. When we see a homeless person or we see someone who's, really run down, we will have a tendency to view, even if we want to cross the street, we'll view them with a sense of pity. And we'll view them, and that's because the Christian worldview is so much a part of just Western society in general. But if you go to a place, and particularly like the Middle East in this time, and really throughout the biblical times, the idea was, and you go into the karma-centered religions, the idea is that's your karma. You deserve it. You're awful. You're low. The gods hate you. The gods did this to you, right? So the idea of publicly humiliating or disdaining someone or spitting on someone, for us that seems like something only maybe children would do at their very ugliest, but this would be a whole society of people who would be free to do that. So I think that he experienced very real public humiliation at the hands of these people who had previously been humiliated or stomped or opposed by him and his righteousness. That would be my guess, is that it's literal. But it could well be, right, that he just knows that others are rejoicing in his downfall. And either way, I think his great cry is here that, God, your wonderful, like, your righteousness is being humiliated. A godly life is being humiliated before the world. The bad guys are winning again. And they're not just winning, they're winning over the righteous. And is that a theme that we might see even today? Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So how are we meant to deal with that when it seems like the ungodly triumph? And I mean, at least we wonder, like, Lord, can't you let the good guys win just a little bit more frequently?
They don't triumph in the end.
Yep, the ungodly don't triumph in the end. It's a short-term victory. Is that what you're trying to say? Yep. Yep. Or that what you're saying, not what you're trying to say. Yep. Yep. So we recognize that God is, again, working on this eternal time scale. And that we need to also view this with an eternal time scale after that fashion. Yeah. Yep. Very important. So then he says, April, do you want to pick up at 16 through 23?
And now my soul is poured out because of my plight. The days of affliction take hold of me. My bones are pierced in me at night, and my gnawing pains take no rest. By great force my garment is disfigured. It binds me about as the collar of my coat. He has cast me into the mire, and I have become like dust and ashes. I cry out to you, but you do not answer me. I stand up, and you regard me. But you have become cruel to me. With the strength of your hand you oppose me. You lift me up to the wind and cause me to ride on it. You spoil my success. For I know that you will bring me to death and to the house appointed for all living.
Excellent. So, here he's going into the very depths of his lament. The idea of his soul being poured out because of his plight. You imagine, like the picture, his life is just, he's running on empty, he's running out, and the days of affliction have taken hold of him. His bones are pierced in him. He's just, everything is agony, as we've seen before. And again, we want to point out, why isn't God stepping in? We'll notice that God does step in at the perfect time, but why isn't God stepping in? Why doesn't he step in sooner? Any guesses?
Sort of testimony to Satan to prove that his faith is strong.
Right on the nose. If God were to step in sooner, then Satan's point would not be utterly embarrassed or refuted. It has to get to this point where the discussion, the conversation comes to its utter end, and it's proven that while Job is absolutely turned upside down and flipped inside out and doesn't know what to think, he's convinced that God has turned on him, he doesn't ever question whether God is good and righteous and true. He just questions how to reconcile the reality of what he knows to God with his circumstance, his situation. So the truth of the matter is, you can imagine that God is viewing this whole situation. In fact, the entire heavenly courtroom, the whole heavenly council is viewing this situation, waiting to see if Job is going to crack. Waiting to see if finally, you think about it, it's kind of amazing to think, but it could get all the way to this point. Job could curse God and Satan could flag wave on that victory. Now, we'd say it's a pretty hollow victory indeed, right? You had to absolutely, hollow out, remove everything from this guy in order to bring him to this point. But Satan will take any victory he can get. We think about another situation several thousand years after this point, when the Son of God hung on the cross for our sin. And all of the trial that went up, the beatings, the false trials, the humiliation, and all that it went, God the Father watches Jesus Christ, God the Son, suffer and drink the entire cup of God's punishment and wrath for us. And if he had said at any given point, that's enough, we're done here, we're taking Jesus off the cross, I'm taking my son back to heaven, then the result would have been our damnation for all eternity. And yet, who could blame God for making such a choice versus seeing his son suffer on the cross the way he did? And yet the Lord, or rather the Father, allowed the Son to suffer all the way to the end of the trial in order to bring glory to God by saving us. And so he is our perfect example, and Job is a darn good example of what it means to suffer to the end of the trial, whether that means losing everything or only losing part of it for a time.
Well, with Jesus, I mean, didn't Satan think that he had a great victory because his own people rejected him, and he was hung on a cross to death? I don't know at what point Satan understood what really happened on the cross, but I think at that point he realized, oh, my fate is sealed. Oh, obviously when Jesus rose from the dead, but I mean, he wanted him to go to the cross, right?
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yep. I would argue, and this is just me guessing, but when Satan fell in the garden after Genesis 3 temptation, I think Satan would say he won. He became God of this world. He became the most powerful being on this planet. He gained his domain, his dominion. I think if you imagine what would have happened if the Jews had accepted Jesus, the kingdom would come immediately. Satan won. He bought himself another 2,000 years at this point of dominion. Satan absolutely believes he still won. And now, having pushed the final battle back to literally only God knows when, he still can, at least for his propaganda campaign, play it off as a victory.
Does he think he can still win?
I think that's the clear indication of the book of Revelation, is that he believes he will win up to the very end. If you ever saw, it was a rather adult movie, but there was a movie with Al Pacino and Keanu Reeves called Devil's Advocate.
Yes.
Yeah. And at one point, there's this like huge dramatic, Al Pacino is playing the devil and Keanu Reeves is playing the one he's tempting. And there's this huge point where he's basically like totally opens up the whole scene to Satan. He said that he's Satan and he's trying to tempt Keanu Reeves to join his side. And Keanu Reeves says, "Haven't you read Revelation? You lose." And Satan says, "Consider the source.
Yep, I remember.
Consider where you're getting your information. Of course, God's going to say that he wins, but you know what, in the end? Satan's true insanity is that he believes that he is going to win or can win some kind of victory against God. That is the true insanity of Satan's world. And if you've ever argued with a narcissist, you know how Satan can fancy that, right? You see a narcissist whenever they're arguing or they get in a fight or whatever, it's always, I win, right? Doesn't matter what they lose, they still will frame it as if they've won, right? And that's how Satan will frame every single victory or rather every single situation and encounter that he's ever had, including these ones, right? Like, you think about it, from Satan's perspective, even though we don't get to see the humiliation of Satan in this to any significant degree, but what is this from Satan's perspective? I got to hurt God's anointed. I got to hurt God's child. I got to experience his pain and relish in it. I got to take things away from one that was God's own. I got to take pleasure or joy away from one that was God's own. I got to make him question even his relationship with God. Satan can count that, even though it's overall a loss, right? He got to enjoy the sickness in his sickness, that victory. So we have to, I think, keep very much in mind that the insanity of Satan is such to see himself always is the victor until that final point when he's proven to be the loser. And it will be the resounding and uniform testimony of all the creatures on heaven and earth to say, this is it, it's final. But that is a part of what's going on in this entire world. A part of it is showing for all the world to see, for all the universe to see, for all the cosmos and the angels of heaven and everything else to see that God's righteousness, holiness, justice, character, perfection is absolutely and uncontestably perfect and wonderful and good, and that any that oppose him will always end only in destruction. Right? Sorry, sermonized there.
I was just assumed he was just so angry that Jesus had done it at the cross, because he heard him say it is finished, and he proclaimed it, down to the end of the world to proclaim that he accomplished salvation. So I was assumed after that it was like he was just going to go down in a ring of fire and take as many people with him or something.
Well, I see the point of Satan.
And he's certainly willing to do that. I mean,
And the fallen angels really oh crap, is at the resurrection.
mm-hmm.
And Satan must have had a lot of explaining to do, to the fallen angels, because that pretty much sealed the fate, right?
The payment was made for sure.
Yeah, the payment was made, but then that was also the victory over death.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know. I just think that Satan had some explaining to do, or he definitely had to keep rallying on the troops, right? Oh no, it's not over. No, keep going. Yeah. We're lying. And what's also really fascinating to me is that God lays out in Daniel, mostly in Daniel and Revelation and other books as well, how it's all going to end. And Satan knows very well how it's written, and I just know that in his mind he thinks he's going to do it differently, and he's going to be tricky, and in his mind he's like, I'm not going to play into that.
Mm-hmm.
He is going to play right into it perfectly, but it's going to be deceptive
Mm-hmm.
to people.
Yep.
It's not going to happen just the way that, there's a lot of people that are smart people, Christians even, that would fall for that,
Mm-hmm. Yep. And again, pointed out that if if you're viewing this, and I don't recommend it as a regular practice, but if you're viewing this from the diabolical perspective, right? Yeah, Jesus died and rose again, but he stopped the kingdom from coming. Talk about the Grinch that stole Christmas. The kingdom was supposed to come 7 years after Jesus' resurrection. Where is it? Satan won from his limited time perspective. And so you can see, again, how the campaign goes. In fact, even to the point now where Luciferianism is absolutely an overt, open religion. And I don't think it's very commonly populated at the moment. It's because atheism and secularism is such a more powerful tool to deceive the masses. But by and large, again, this undercurrent of Luciferian or satanic worship will always be either covertly or overtly occurring in the world. To a very, very high degree. So where do we get that? Oh, so the point being, if we were going to individualize this or contextualize this down to your specific circumstance and my specific circumstance, then as we suffer, as we struggle, and I know that we all in this room, and praise God, we share our sufferings and we share our struggles and we share our trials, but just recognize that every trial, every difficulty, every struggle, everything that the Lord allows you to go through is an opportunity to glorify him. That on a micro scale, this incredible man, Job, and his test of faith here is being exemplified in all of our lives. And we're being tempted to faithlessness or to disobedience or to rebellion or to rejection, right? We're all being tempted to that. It doesn't take this much, right, for it to bring us, or as much as Job, to bring us to the point of potentially going there. But the Lord very specifically, just as in this case, is waiting till the trial is over. And he is the one who can say without any question and with all authority, I won. I'm right. I'm proved. My righteousness, my truth, my salvation in Jesus Christ is vindicated in the life of Nobu and Joy and Cadence and so on and so forth, right? It's a big deal. that our lives are endued with exactly that much value. Did you tie something into your hair? And now you can't get it out.
No, I can't. I just choose not to.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure we didn't need to get the scissors out. It's right up top. All right, so. All right, so we're getting into the good stuff here. He says, "Surely he would not stretch out his hand against a heap of ruin if they cry out when he destroys it. Have I not wept for him who is in trouble? Has not my soul grieved for the poor? But when I looked for good, evil came to me, and when I waited for light, then came darkness. My heart is in turmoil and cannot rest. Days of affliction comfort me. I go about mourning, but not in the sun. I stand up in the assembly and cry for help. I am the brother of jackals and a companion of ostriches," which actually sounds like a lot more fun than he makes it sound. So clearly I don't know ostriches as well as he does. "My skin grows black and falls from me. My bones burn with fever. My harp is turned to mourning and my flute to the voice of those who weep." I love throughout this that there's such a sense of his picture of what godly morality is really about. And one of the things is, have I not wept with him who was in trouble? And has not my soul grieved for the poor? I love that he continually points that out, these little hints at what his true righteousness was. He's saying, I didn't rejoice in the suffering of others. In fact, I wept for them. And we're going to see even more so. He identified with those in suffering, even though he had great wealth and great ability, and yet here he is mourning and suffering, and nobody seems to be doing that with him. Even his friends, who, again, kudos to them for showing up, but even his friends are not really mourning for him, weeping for him any longer. All right, verse 31, or chapter 31, our final chapter for tonight, and I think a really satisfying conclusion to Job's words. Whose turn is it? April's turn? Do you want to read? Or is it Brian? Who went last?
April went last, didn't you? Yeah.
Okay. So 1 through, actually, if you do 1 through 15.
I have made a covenant with my eyes. How then could I look at a virgin? And what is the portion of God from above, for the inheritance of the Almighty from on high? Is it not disaster to the criminal, and misfortune to those who practice injustice? Does he not see my ways and count all my steps? If I have walked with deception, my foot has hurried after deceit. Let him weigh me with accurate scales, and let God know my integrity. If my step is turned from the way, or my heart followed my eyes, or if any spot is stuck to my hands, let me sow and another eat, and let my crops be uprooted. If my heart has been enticed by a woman, or I have lurked at my neighbor's doorway, may my wife grind grain for another, and let others kneel down over her. For that would be a lustful crime. Moreover, it would be wrongdoing, punishable by judges. For it would be fire that consumes to Abaddon, and would uproot all my increase. If I have rejected the claim of my male or female slaves, when they filed a complaint against me, what then could I do when God arises? And when he calls me to account, how am I to answer him? Did he who made me in the womb not make him? And the same one create us in the womb?
Awesome. Okay, so now it's kind of funny that it takes Job this long to get here. This is the argument that I think his friends were looking for from the very beginning, but he didn't open up to it. Now you're going to see that this is him clinging to his integrity, defending his honesty and his righteousness. But this is what they're waiting for. They keep hinting around, well, maybe it's this kind of sin, maybe it's that kind of sin. What's this secret sin? And now he's going to go calling down on, on the witness of God. In other words, saying that God I ask God to attest to this and to my honesty or my truthfulness in this. But then he's going to give this accounting of his righteousness. And we would ask, just out of more curiosity than anything else, why do you think he waits so so long to give a line-by-line defense of his righteousness? Why 31 chapters in? Why not start with this, right? They started immediately accusing him. Why in the world does he wait for such a long time to finally give them what they asked for?
Grasping at straws.
Just finally run out of other things to say.
Whatever.
I'll tell you.
Give me what you want.
That's a good
He thought they'd come to their senses on their own.
It's a good possibility. I don't have a right or wrong answer on this, by the way. I don't even have something in mind. I think it's curious.
Or Job just did not think that his friends will keep attacking him.
Yeah.
He just assumed that they will support him, from the beginning.
Right.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So he's kind of holding out hope for them.
Yeah.
Like, come on, guys. Like, you know me. You're supposed to be on my team.
Well, like when a person's accused of murder, I watch a lot of Dateline, and they're innocent, they're taken off guard because they know they didn't do it. The other person thinks they did it, so they're coming from two different perspectives. So they're not going into it thinking they need to defend themselves because it's not the perspective they're coming from.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm totally with Nagu on this one. I think a lot of it is that he would have thought that his friends would have recognized his righteousness and all the wonderful things that he did for people, and they just kept accusing him. I think finally he comes out and he's like, okay, I'm gonna have to mention these things, and I think he's a humble man too, so he's not gonna sit there and just talk about himself how great he is. So I think, it took him quite a while, and I think that when he does do this, he says it in a very humble way, but very matter of fact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a profound point. Because to sit around and say, all right, fine, I'm super righteous. I always do good for people. I never sinned like this, and I never sinned like that, and I never sinned like this, and it's just so me-centered. So I wonder if that's not another function of Job's righteousness, that he's going, I'm not going to sit around and parade how good I am in front of all you people. Because undoubtedly, given their conduct thus far, they would be so ashamed. Well, they will be so ashamed when God finally brings this all to light that they won't even have words. They'll be awestruck with how shameful their conduct and lives are in relationship to the righteousness of Job. So here's, interestingly, Job having lost everything, but still holding back and showing this humility and not wanting to parade his good works before men. That's a really profound point. That's a really profound point. That even in this, right, he's maintaining that. So let's look at how Job defines righteousness. And I've mentioned this before, but how much or little stock do you think can we put in Job's standard of righteousness? Just out of curiosity. Especially in light of the first chapter and second chapter.
What do you mean, stock, like as far as us looking to him as our standard of living of righteousness, or?
Not so much that, but just when he chooses, well, let's put it this way. If someone is going to try to exonerate or vindicate themselves today, what are they going to say? Well, I'm not racist, because that's the worst thing you can be in today's society is racist. Or I'm not bigoted, I'm not this and that. We've got this whole societal set of standards and an ethic and a morality that has nothing to do with that of God. However, Job is going to point out his things that are worthy of defense, right? So what I want to do as we come to this is, I think that we could say with all confidence that Job has the right idea. Or in other words, Job's priorities and beliefs about righteousness match up with God's beliefs about righteousness. And the reason why I believe that is because Job is such a righteous man from God's perspective that he's the one that God offers up. So I think we can say that when Job puts forth his qualities and his beliefs about what's important to God, that we could say, yeah, these characteristics, these ethics, these morals are important to God. So, first of all, I have made a covenant with my eyes. Why then should I look upon a virgin or a young woman? So clearly this isn't just talking about seeing, right? This is a euphemism for sexual lust or desire, right? So this purity of gaze, the fact that he does not look with lust upon young women is, of course, also echoed by Jesus, right, in the Sermon on the Mount, right? Anyone who looks upon a woman with lust in his heart or lust for her, he's already committed adultery with her in his heart spiritually. It's a fascinating thing that would show up so early in the biblical record. And I think it's interesting because it shows us that it is not just sinful action, but even intent. What's wrong with looking on, and he's a man, so he would look upon a woman, but women could look upon men with similar lust. What is the problem with looking upon another person with lust in that way?
It's disrespectful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It reduces them to a thing that can bring physical satisfaction to you. They're not a person, they're not made in God's image, they're just a vehicle for some sense of pleasure. That's pretty awful. Any other reason why this would be awful from Job?
Self-centered desire, like you're kind of owning that person in your head.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah.
Also very disrespectful to your spouse.
He's married. It's a whole nother, I wouldn't say this would be okay. It's okay to lust after people as long as you're not married. That's not what I'm saying at all. But this point that he's also in a committed relationship with his wife. Though she has not passed this test with his flying colors as he has, she's still his wife. So here he is repudiating and saying, you know what? It's interesting to me that when Job wants to exonerate his righteousness, even in this time, which we would say has a different sexual morality to our time, that's what he starts with. I think that's pretty fascinating. That even then, before the law of Moses was given, before the New Testament was written, before the Old Testament was written, even still, sexual morality was regarded as a primary expression or a first place of ultimate morality. Well, I just point out, how do we regard sexual immorality in our age? It's
as a culture, it's fine. You know, how many guys have been around in the past? It doesn't hurt to look, you know.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't hurt to look.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Doesn't hurt to look.
What she doesn't know doesn't hurt her.
Mm-hmm.
You have to try before to see if things work.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Yeah. If you're talking about marriage and
You have to try things out before you get married.
Yeah.
Or-
Yep, absolutely. It's expected. In fact, anyone who is any kind of monogamy or doesn't practice premarital sex or premarital cohabitation, they're weirdos. You have to. Come on. Don't you have to find out if you're, compatible, or how do you know unless you've tried lots of people or something like that? Which even the very nature of that language is grotesque, right? You're trying people, like Nobu said, it's not that far off from treating people like possessions or slaves, right? Just try people out, see if they make you feel happy, because that's the purpose of it, right? Is to please you. Wait a minute, that was never the purpose. Purpose was always to bring glory to God, and the fact that it's enjoyable, those things are enjoyable, is only such because of His grace and mercy, and in a right relationship to how He created that gift to exist. But yeah, we would, right, when the world looks at things like sodomy or homosexuality, they say, oh, that's fine, right? But sexual immorality is centrally disrespectful to God, because it was what He gave us to create more creatures in His image. It is one of the most sacred things and the most precious actions and relationships, and we turn to talking about a husband and a wife, and then of parent and child that God ever gave us. It is so powerful and important. So should it be any surprise that that is under constant attack by our enemy, trying to degrade us into thinking that it's no big deal. It's just a physical input. It's just two bodies doing a thing together. How could that be so important, right?
I definitely see sexual immorality in a culture or civilization as kind of the temperature of where that society is.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I think, historically, when you see as nations before they go into destruction,
Mm-hmm.
you see sexual immorality becoming more and more prevalent.
Yep. Absolutely. And it's kind of interesting because when we think about the Lord Jesus Christ's prophetic statement that as in the day of Noah, so it shall be the days of marrying and given in marriage, what kind of marriages were going on then? It was marriages between human women and demons. It was an ultimate level of ultimate sexual immorality, right? And so the reality that marriage is expressly what's under attack, not just in America, around the world. Right, on the world level, you've got people and nations flying pride flags and all this stuff. They will be marrying and given in marriage in a way that expressly defies and dishonors God all the way up to the time of the rapture, and I'd say all the way up through the time of the second coming for his judgment. It is a sign of us rejecting, as Romans 1:18 through 32 tells us. It is a sign that we are rejecting the very core, simplest things for us to get right.
Yeah.
Right? This is just the simplest, most obvious. God made it this way. Our bodies are designed to reflect it. Our temperaments are designed to reflect it. Our desires are all designed to reflect it. And when we start screwing that up, boy, we must really have come a long way from what he's pointed out. So I think it's just fascinating that he starts with this commitment that he's not lusted after another young woman in this case. And then he goes further to point out that God sees and counts all his steps and his ways, and he's comfortable, calling upon God as his witness that was not his. And then he goes on to talk about his relationship to the truth. If I've walked with falsehood, or if my foot has hastened to deceit, let me be weighed on honest scales, that God may know my integrity. So he's saying, I haven't lied, I haven't deceived, I've been running a huge scam here. Next, if my step is turned from the way, or my heart walked after my eyes, or my hand spotted here's to my hands, then let me sow and another eat. Yes, let my harvest be rooted out. So he's setting up consequences, saying, if the Lord sees me as guilty in this, then it's totally something I didn't know about, right? His heart walked after his eyes. In other words, if he went after his own selfish desire over God's good, and then it gets a little bit, it goes back to the sexual theme more directly. If my heart has been enticed by a woman, or if I have lurked at my neighbor's door. So this is the idea of lusting after and seeking to seduce his neighbor's wife. He says, then let my wife grind for another, and let others bow down over her. That euphemism might be a little bit distant to us, but yeah. He's saying that if he has been, he's essentially setting the stakes before God. He's saying if he's been sexually immoral, or if he's been sexually immoral, then someone else should know his wife carnally. Does that make sense? That's this kneeling over her. He's basically saying, I don't know if we'd quite use the word rape, but that's really what he's pointing out. And he's not saying that that's something that he wants to happen. He's pointing out that this is how strongly convicted he is about his sexual morality, that the worst thing that would happen, someone taking advantage of his wife in that way, he's comfortable making that statement. That's how confident he is in his sexual morality, that he has his sexuality under control in a godly way. For that would be wickedness. Yes, it would be iniquity deserving of judgment. For that would be a fire that consumes to destruction and would root out all my increase. The other interesting thing about someone else laying with your wife is it means that your offspring are illegitimate. They're not yours. Or at least They'll never be sure to be yours, right? So this is a fairly huge thing to be putting forth. And then he says, if I have despised the cause of my male or female servant when they complain against me. And this is interesting because that means that his male and female servants probably did complain against him, as any employee will, and yet he didn't turn a deaf ear to them, is what he's pointing out, right? But he was meaningfully caring for on behalf of his, well, they'd say slaves or servants. We'd say employees, right? Those who are subject to him. Then he points out that he's kept, if I have kept the poor from their desire or caused the eyes of the widow to fail. So again, the idea of godliness involving caring for the poor and caring for widows, caring for those who are less disadvantaged or less advantaged is an important part, or the better part of godliness. And he's saying, I feel confident. I did that. I did that with my great wealth. I cared for the poor and the widow. Or eaten my morsel by myself. This is an interesting picture, so that the fatherless could not eat of it. He's basically saying, if I'd sat on my own hill of grain and produce and success and kept that from being available to those who are hurt or hurting, then again, calling down the curses of God on himself. So again, care for the youth, care for the weak, care for those who are needy is always a part of true godliness. If I've seen anyone perish for lack of clothing, or any poor man without covering, if his heart has not blessed me, and if he was not warmed with the fleece of my sheep, if I have raised my hand against the fatherless, when I saw the help, I had help at the gate, then I let my arm fall from my shoulder, let my arm be torn from the socket. For the destruction from God is a terror to me, and because of his magnificence, I cannot endure. So here again, pointing out that he can point to concrete instances when he helped, fed the poor, clothed those who were needy around him. He turned his ear to the cause of those who were beneath him or subjected to him. Cadence, do you want to take off from verse 24 to 28?
If I have made gold my hope, or said to find gold, you are my confidence. If I have rejoiced because my wealth was great, and because my hand had gained much. If I had observed the sun when it shines, or the moon moving in brightness, so that my heart had been secretly enticed, and my mouth had kissed my hand, this also would be an iniquity deserving of judgment, for I would have denied God who is above. How
cool is this? So what's his next exoneration of his own righteousness?
Money?
Yeah. He said, if I've loved money, then condemn me. But he hasn't. Now, he was very, very wealthy. It's kind of interesting. There's certainly an avarice that can exist when we're poor or we have less money. We can be jealous of those who have more. We can be jealous of the money that we wish we had or whatever. And so there can be a love of money in that sense. But I think it's probably a far greater temptation to love money when you've got tons of it, right? When you're experiencing all the pleasure that it can provide or the sense of security that it can provide. And yet Job can say with all confidence that he didn't make gold his hope. He didn't make money his confidence. He truly trusted in the Lord at every given point. This idea of being secretly enticed towards worshiping the sun or the moon, but he points out that he has a right relationship to money, and he feels incredibly confident about that. So, what do you think the greatest challenges relating to money are in our lives? 'Cause I know none of us would struggle with money, but what sorts of sins are we tempted to, or can we be tempted to, surrounding money?
To keep it to yourself, for yourself all the time. Don't give it to anybody.
Yeah. Dragon tendencies, right? Just trying to pile up our own little mountain of gold and trying to absolutely... and that's not to say that it's wrong to save and plan, but if ultimately, as we all know, we are meant to be giving generously, sharing, caring for those in need, caring for those in difficult situations, giving to the church and all the other things that we give to. As someone once said, if you're wondering if you have a problem with the love of money, try giving some away. And then based on that experience, you can know if you're in a bad spot. So that's one, hoarding.
putting your hope in money, your faith in money
Mm-hmm.
Greed.
over God.
Mm-hmm.
Greed.
Greed. Yep. Greed. Always wanting more. I had a friend who said he was a fundraiser. So he would dealt with what we would all call in this room very wealthy people, and he would like spend time with them and try to get them to support various causes. That was his thing. Anyway, quite a job to have to do.
Sounds horrible.
Doesn't it though? I was trying not to sound judgy, but I'm like, sincerely, a fate worse than death.
No, not that show.
But he said, the funny thing is, Brad, I've never met a rich man. What are you talking about? You've driven in this guy, gone to that private golf course with that guy. You met these people, they're worth millions. He's like, yeah, but they've always got someone richer that they can look to further up the stream. And they're living a pretty reasonable lifestyle at, $250,000 a year. But, or whatever it is, $250,000, I guess is. Anyway, it doesn't matter. The point is, they can always justify there's something else to want. There's more to get. There's more to, yeah. So there's some more immorality that can come regarding money. Can you think of any others? If Paul says to Timothy, the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, what other kinds of evil might come for the love of money? Theft, yeah, absolutely. If we love money so much that we're willing to take it dishonestly or, maybe, cheat others after one fashion or another, right? If we're willing to give up our honesty in order to gain more money, that's, right? The love of money causing us to defraud ourselves. Yep. Any other that you can think of?
Like putting it before relationships.
Mm-hmm.
For the people that God has put in your life, loving money more than loving human beings.
Absolutely. And I would go even one step further in that. This would be my final thought on money, is using money to manipulate others. Using money, like understanding finally that money is just money, but then you get, there's certainly all of our sin natures could tend to this, but like the possibility to use money to manipulate, to control, to get people to do what you want, right? And so in other words, viewing money as power, and therefore trying to use that power to manipulate others. All those things are tragic, and tragically would draw a person's heart further and further away from anything that is God-like or Christ-like, we could say. And Job is confident in saying, I never made gold my confidence. Had a lot of it, but it never possessed him. He always possessed it. And that's probably because he clearly, at least as we are forced to believe this account that he gives us, he used it regularly to build up, to encourage, to help others. He understood what money was for. All right. Who we left off? Joy, would you mind doing 29 through 37?
Yeah. If I have rejoiced at my enemy's misfortune or gloated over the trouble that came to him, I have not allowed my mouth to sin by invoking a curse against their life. If those of my household have never said, who has not been filled with Job's meat, but no stranger had to spend the night in the street, for my door was always open to the traveler. If I have concealed my sin as people do, by hiding my guilt in my heart, because I so feared the crowd and so dreaded the contempt of the clans, that I kept silent and would not go outside. Oh, that I had someone to hear me. I sign now my defense. Let the Almighty answer me. Let my accuser put his indictment in writing. Surely I would wear it on my shoulder. I would put it on like a crown. I would give him an account of my every step. I would present it to him as to a ruler.
Awesome. Good. So
Mine is in parentheses. Is your guys' between 35 and 37? It's in parentheses. Is yours?
Mine too, yeah.
Oh, I wonder where that's in parentheses.
So that would generally mean that the texts in which the New King James and King James include it, and then there's other texts that don't include it.
Oh.
So, textual criticism is a huge. Yeah, this is the New King James.
Oh, okay.
So yours is yours ESV or NASB?
I always forget what mine is.
NIV, yep. So NIV is built on the critical text, just like the NASB, the ESV. So most of those modern translations will take the critical text over.
Oh, I thought maybe it was like his thoughts, not his words.
No. Or at least I assume that's what this is. I assume that's what that would mean. But you'd have to see. Yeah, here we go. Yep. So anyway, I'm afraid I'm not prepared to give a more complete answer on that. But we would want to point out that the next thing that Job believes to be righteous is that he didn't rejoice in the destruction of him who hated him. That's a pretty tall order, right? I mean, I hate to say it, but like when Bill Gates' wife left him, when Fauci stopped appearing on TV, like part of me rejoiced a little bit. We like seeing bad things happen to bad people. And yet, and maybe he means here excessive rejoicing, but I think that, again, based on Job's track record, we can say with confidence, he didn't even rejoice in the destruction in the sense of when bad things happened to his enemies. He had such a godly perspective that he was willing to show mercy in his heart, in his attitude towards even those who had sinned. And I love that he goes even further. Even I have not allowed my mouth to sin by asking a curse on his soul or on his life. So, you're talking about the parentheses in 30 and 32?
No, 35
Okay.
to 37
Okay,
in
good.
my book.
Yep,
I don't
okay.
have any earlier.
Yeah, it's interesting because, the New King James here has put those two as parenthetical thoughts. So maybe that's what it's usually a footnote. We'll check.
I have quotes of the who has not been filled with Job's meat, like
Mhm.
quotation marks,
Yep.
but not
Interesting. Translational choices, I think, on that point. So his point is, though, that he did not ask for a curse on his soul. That's a pretty remarkable thing, that he regarded as a sin to call down the curses of God on those who opposed him. Now, we could say, or it could be, that he's expressly talking about people who opposed him but were not opposed to God. But it seems that generally he thought and saw the judgment of others as not being his problem. He thought it was sinful to be sizing up others and trying to assess their just or due punishment. And interestingly, as we're not encouraged to pray against, that is to say, pray for the judgment of the wicked, we know that the Lord will bring it about in his time, and only he has the righteousness to give that just tool or just judgment. It's cool to see that Job seems to have separated himself entirely from the business of judging others and asking God to bring down that justice. Now, see, that's kind of interesting, because he's also talked about how he's been an intercessor for the weak and that he's defended or broken the teeth of the fangs of the wicked. So he's not saying that he's not morally involved. He's not saying that he's not morally involved in judging wickedness, but he's expressly not calling. But it's really interesting that even though he's going to, he took his position seriously in judging evil and opposing wickedness, acts of wickedness or crime, he did not seem like it was worthwhile. It was his place to instruct God on who to call judgments on. It's an interesting balance, right? Because we could say, well, it's all God's job to judge, so I'm not going to make any moral judgments about anything. That's not my problem, right? And just totally disengage with the concept of righteousness or opposing wickedness in the world. And that would be wrong, right? Additionally, though, we could get so personally involved that we're calling down and celebrating in some way or any way or every way the destruction of the ungodly, right? It's as one wonderful story that Jim Ranella, the leader of Navigators, when I was at Navigators at CSU, said, he listened to this one fellow call into a show, and the show that he was calling into was it was something about homosexuality, and the Christian called in to say, well, you're all going to burn in hell. He said, That might be so, but there's no reason for you to be so happy about it, right? That's not the heart of Christ. That's not the heart of God. So anyway, he sees that as being a sin. I think that's an interesting distinction to make. He provides lodging for the traveler, for the sojourner. And interesting, he said, if I've covered my transgression, and some translations have as men, but that's because the word Adamah, the Hebrew word Adamah can mean men, or it can mean Adam. So it's fascinating to think, and this is a bit interpretive, but it's fascinating to think that if you follow this rendering of Adamah, which is not the usual word for man, it's Ish, and Isha is woman, but to use Adamah here suggests that perhaps Job knew that Adam covered his sin, right? When did Adam cover his sin? Well, he tried to cover up his sin with the fig leaves, whatever the leaves are, right? He tried to cover up rather than deal with his sin. So it's fascinating that Job here is making a potential allusion to hiding his sin in his heart, just like Adam hid sin in the garden. Because I feared the great multitude and dreaded the contempt. I kept silent and I did not go out of the door. So, again, just the point that he wants to stand before the Lord. He feels confident in his sinlessness. Noba, would you read our final verses for tonight and we'll close up? 38 through 40.
If my land cries out against me, and all its furrows are wet with tears, if I have devoured its yield without payment, or broken the spirit of its tenants, then let briars come up instead of wheat, and weeds instead of barley. The words of Job are ended.
Good. This is cool. I think this is just cool. So he ends up with absolute, defending his absolute professional integrity. That if the land could cry out that he'd farmed and ranched on, if his land could cry out against him and say that he had been unjust in his stewardship over the earth and in his involvement with basically professional integrity, then he would see that as being worthy of condemnation, but he hasn't had that. So, if we were going to summarize this, Job's defense, and I love this, the words of Job are ended. It's over. He said his final piece. We looked at his sexual morality. He saw that as being key in defending his innocence. His honesty, his relationship to the truth, his not lying. Again, his It's interesting that he defends his sexual morality both in terms of desiring a young virgin or desiring after his neighbor's wife, right? Either lust he uses as being worthy of total condemnation. Caring for those who work for him, caring for those who are poor, caring for those who are weak, caring for those or looking after those who are in a compromised position. The love of money. And finally, wrath, or willing to show hatred or desire the destruction of those who are a problem. If he'd hid his transgressions, and so on. So those are pretty huge issues, evidently, to God. And that's what Job saw as pretty huge issues. I think we can rightly prioritize those issues in our own walk with Christ and say, this is the kind of morality. Remember, this is before the law of Moses. This is just core morality that God always seeks, honors, we could say demands. And Job's words are ended. And interestingly, we're going to see that this silences his friends. They finally are out of words to say. So, shall we close with a word of prayer? All right. Father, how we thank you for the example that Job is, Lord. We thank you that the perspective that it provides on our suffering and our struggles and our trials. We praise you for the gift of this open book, these things that Job did not know. And yet he's useful to show so much of your plan and your power and your purpose on this earth. Please give us that wisdom and patience that we lack in our times of trial and suffering. Lord, let us value and see the truth that you have put forth, the righteousness that you have declared, that it is truly reflective of your character and personality and will. Please, O Lord, give us wisdom and humility to learn continually from your word, Father, and seek to glorify you regardless of what our situation or state may be. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.